I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. Is British Columbia going to suspend parts of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, also known as DRIPA? Well, according to the Canadian press, at a meeting between leaders and the Premier of British Columbia, David Eby outlined his plan to suspend certain parts of the Declaration. So, DRIPA is a law based on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which aims to protect the rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada. Back when it was passed in 2019, it was hailed as a path forward to build better relations between First Nations and the province of British Columbia. BC is still the only province in Canada to adopt its own law for it, but now it's in jeopardy. So, to talk about this, I'm joined by Robert Phillips, the political executive of the First Nations Summit in BC. Robert Phillips, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, very happy to be here.
So I'm wondering to start, can you tell us a bit about this meeting with David Eby? I'm wondering, how many leaders were present?
Well, as the meetings continue, we have noticed a growing number of chiefs and First Nation leadership in attendance. And I think this is because of the growing concerns and subsequently the growing frustration, and even to the point of anger with some chiefs of why this is happening.
So, at these meetings, what does the Premier had to say?
Well, at this point now, the Premier is talking about a suspension. And he came right out after the meeting, even though it was a confidential meeting, and did talk about this pause that he would like to see of about 3 years until, the Gitga'ala court case goes through the Supreme Court of Canada. And like I was saying, with this growing concern with chiefs, over 100 in attendance, and even at our First Nations Summit Chiefs meeting, we've seen about a 50% increase in attendance. And that's because, of the concern that, it started with after the Gitga'ala court case, where the Premier got in front of the microphone and in front of the media and made the announcement that he was going to amend DRIPA, the Declaration Act. And then not only was there amendments, then we potentially talked about, discussions about an off-ramp. And that to us was interesting because, potentially we could then have discussions about, not having amendments whatsoever. But then the amendments did happen, and we did see the amendments, and that's all under, again, we're not allowed to discuss it. It's under non-disclosure agreement. And so we're trying to the best of our ability to inform the public and especially our communities, because you needed this NDA, this non-disclosure agreement signed before you're able to review. And then some chiefs, of course, could not and did not sign the NDA. So that's why the numbers weren't, that's another reason why they increased in numbers of people and chiefs in attendance. And then eventually, the Premier got to the point of, okay, we're going to, and it was within 24 hours because he basically said again to the media that he was going to, it was almost like a take it or leave it. I can't remember his exact wording, but he didn't say it to us. Again, he said it to the media. And then within 24 hours, he came back because he seen the response, and then there was a mention of a pause. And that's where we're at now, looking, but we can't pause DRIPA. And it's just like pausing our Aboriginal rights and title. It's just like pausing the decades of work that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People have put in. And in the last 6, 7 years, we've had DRIPA in British Columbia, and we commend it, the NDP government here in British Columbia and the opposition parties as well, the BC Conservatives and the Greens, for coming together and implementing and making it law, DRIPA here in British Columbia. But now we're in a situation where the Premier wants us to pause, and we just don't agree with amendments. and we certainly don't agree at this point with a pause too.
So, when this was first passed, the Declaration Act was hailed as a path forward to build better relations between First Nations and the province of British Columbia. But now that sentiment has seemingly changed. And I'm wondering, what do you think changed in that time?
Well, I think leadership changed in the NDP government. We went from Premier Horgan, who was a champion for First Nations and this DRIPA, and when there was opposition, whether publicly or within caucus, he stood up for again our Aboriginal rights and title and treaty, because we do have some modern treaties as well in British Columbia and historical treaties. So Premier Horgan really stood up and to the oppositions, whether it was across the floor in the legislature or out in public, and said we have to have reconciliation after the last 150 years plus here in British Columbia, where, as everybody knows, we weren't allowed to vote, we couldn't have a lawyer, and then the number of court cases that went through the system, starting with Calder and leading up to all the ones that we have now, Silcoteen, Delgamuuk, the list is long. Sparrow, all recognizing our Aboriginal rights and title here in British Columbia. And so, with that, and then eventually, the Premier Eby, ran on a platform of including First Nations here in British Columbia and this reconciliation and DRIPA. And so, after the election, that's when we noticed, and he just barely got in, we noticed a shift, a noticeable shift after one of our meetings. And this, of course, was very concerning to the Leadership Council. And because, as you know, Leadership Council is an advocacy body of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the First Nations Summit, and the BC AFN here in British Columbia. So we had that meeting, and of course, we then reported back to our organizations, and that's when we noticed that there was starting to be, uh, if not opposition, like concerns around DRIPA. And certainly after the court cases, Gigatla and Cowichan, and then we noticed public opinion. And so that's when we needed someone like Premier Horgan to stand up and champion the law that is in place today. And we noticed Premier Eby was then talking about amendments and sending out information. And instead of standing up for the law and Aboriginal rights and title in British Columbia, he kind of folded in a way to this public pressure that at the time people thought, which was misinformation based on prejudice, racism, and not reading the court case correctly around Cowichan. And even the mayor of Richmond himself standing up and saying, basically, houses, property, businesses, land values, mortgages were all in doubt coming from this single court case. And then people were concerned how many land claims were happening in British Columbia, when in fact this has been going on for decades. And now, the what we have to tell the public and the strategy that we have there is that, in British Columbia, there are no treaties, agreements, or other constructive arrangements, especially treaties. We just got 3 treaties, which we're all proud of, but like with a minimal number of treaties in British Columbia, there's no way to reconcile this Aboriginal rights and title and the land and resources and the waters and everything that goes along with it. And so this was all in doubt, and it was being reported to the media in Richmond, and people were worried they're going to literally lose their houses. And we had to say, like, not speaking for the Cowichan, but they were very honorable people that have been there for thousands of years, since time immemorial. And they were saying, and I think we were saying, private property is not on the table. Like, it's something that people don't have to. Banks were saying as well, like, mortgages will still be given out for those particular areas. There is a bit of a downturn in real estate in British Columbia, and people may be blaming First Nations even for that. And we see the blame game going on. And because of that, we're in a situation where we notice that there is that prejudice and racism towards the people in schools and in cafes and hospitals and education systems. So, this is all a growing concern because although the BC Conservatives are saying they're going to abolish DRIPA, and if they get in power, they're going to take it out. We have noticed the NDP government, in particular, the premier, saying that with these amendments, but again, amendments or suspensions or delays or a pause is the same basic thing, because at the end you have a gutted out DRIPA, and we look at DRIPA like it is a toolbox. It's a mechanism, not only for because we're not after recognition of Aboriginal title because we already have that in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, which we all know. And what DRIPA is I keep calling it so people understand it, is a toolbox. It's a mechanism. It's a framework for not only recognition of Aboriginal rights and title, but implementation. So we were aligning all the laws in British Columbia and the ones that matter now, because we know what this is all about. This is basically about access to our resources, our land, our water. And so DRIPA was aligning laws. These colonial laws have been that have been in place for over 100 years, and we were aligning laws like Mineral Tenure Act, Environmental Assessment. The list is long. And we were implementing it through ways that we would help out too with potentially major projects that possibly could expedite it. Because an example being at Squamish when they Squamish Nation when they had their LNG project and they set up an environmental assessment process. We could do that right across the province, and so that they not only have the meaningful consultation that we get from Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, but also that free, prior, and informed consent that we get from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
So I wanted to go back to what Premier David Eby was saying. I'm wondering, what is the rationale about BC wanting to suspend DRIPA in the first place?
That's what we don't understand. That's where the frustration is. We don't understand, especially in light of, this economy that we're in now, with the illegal Trump tariffs that are hit upon Canada, with what we see the federal government doing in terms of major projects and building around housing and infrastructure, and especially for water. We need to make sure that the Prime Minister and the Premier know that First Nations have to be part of these projects. Not all have major projects in their backyard. We need to have water, infrastructure, and housing as well. And these will be major projects in areas that are northern, interior, coastal, and not only urban. And, where we get that infrastructure set up. And these are projects that will not only benefit, I do believe, First Nations in those areas, but as well for all of British Columbians in those particular areas as well, throughout all of British Columbia. So when Premier Eby, started to we're starting to identify now, where the problem we kind of knew all along because we've been talking to ministers and senior officials, and although everybody is backing up the premier, we know it's coming from the premier's office, and so we have been trying to say to the premier, hold off here, not just a pause, but pull back and let's not go ahead with this. Let's take this off ramp so we can continue to do this work and or just stop with the discussions to amend or pause DRIPA, because if we go in that direction, we're looking at he's fearful of DRIPA interfering with projects and things of that nature, and DRIPA dictating how they do business, but they're still the governing party, they're governing government, and they make the laws. And at this point, DRIPA is law. And so, I do look at this as almost like three steps back in order to make two steps forward. And dare I say, like even three steps back to only make one step forward, or even three steps back to no steps forward. This would take us back decades here in British Columbia. And it took us so long to get here on the backs of those that worked on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's so many across Canada that worked on that. And this was basically an opportunity to show the world. And we were heading in that direction. And now, in the last, year since the NDP and Premier Eby working on, basically all the work is either paused or slowed down a lot. We were working on not only those areas that I talked about, but heritage and conservation, for example, emergency management. These are areas that are pertaining to our land resources, energy and mining, and water. So we were working on all these areas, but we notice now the things are not moving along as they were.
So, if parts of DRIPA were suspended, how would that affect First Nations rights in the province?
Well, as I mentioned, we still have recognition, of course, and through treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements, we will have implementation of our Aboriginal rights. And I know it's not as concerning for those that have treaties in British Columbia, because they have the governance and the authorities and the laws to continue on in that work. But there are not many treaties in British Columbia. So for the majority, this would mean going into, projects that potentially come to their area that they would have to start from the ground up with their own mechanisms and governance. So I think that's the key here is that First Nations, continue to work on their governance and be at a point where they are able to respond to all the, assessments and everything else that hits their communities, and looking at all the projects, whether big or small, and then responding to them accordingly. So it kind of makes us all play off one another, like everybody has their own systems in place, which is important. But if we had laws where, we could have the alignments of laws, and because once you have alignment of laws with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, then you have, policy development follows. And then not only policy development, but then you have, the monitoring that's necessary, but especially the enforcement, and the enforcement of the that comes from monitoring. So, you have guardians on the ground, they monitor, but right now, in general, we don't have the enforcement. So with the alignment, it starts with the laws, and it goes right through the government, and as well, then, industry that are looking in to do these major projects. Because let's be honest, that's what this is all about. It's talking about our lands and resources and our water. And industry coming into British Columbia looking to invest. If they had governing systems that were set up all throughout British Columbia, and they had the certainty on the ground, then there would be more investments, not only to British Columbia, but in particular to First Nations. And that's what we were setting up. And now, because of this pause, the work is slowed down drastically, if not stopped. In some areas, we had a land act that potentially right across British Columbia that could have been very helpful as well. That stopped, and we noticed a slowdown in, Mineral Tenure Act, as I mentioned, and environmental assessment, and the list is growing longer and longer because we're not at the table, we're not negotiating, we're not co-developing. And that's another important word, the co-development of all these laws and legislation and DRIPA itself. Because that, we've seen success stories as well, and like in education, even though I'm not too involved in programs and services, but in education where we have, First Nations or Indigenous education councils throughout all of British Columbia, where they're teaching the kids, about our history here in British Columbia, so that they grow up knowing that there is Aboriginal title on the ground. It's not just Crown title. And that goes back to the essence of the question here in British Columbia, that a lot of people are fearful, as I mentioned earlier, about losing their land. It is Aboriginal title and Crown title, and that's what we're trying to work out here in British Columbia, whether it's through treaties, agreements, or other constructive arrangements. And because of that, there's many titles that are on that, one being just only fee simple. And so, we're not, I remember being a chief negotiator for the Northern Schwettem, the North Shuswap, and basically, I remember a lady coming up in a public forum and asking the question, "Are you going to take my house?" And we had to respond accordingly, very directly. We are not after fee simple lands or private property, unless it's on a willing seller, willing buyer. And we had to say that because people were fearful and the misinformation was going out. And so here we are in a situation now where, I do believe that we have to continue, this critical work. And the pause is not the way to go because it just basically slows down or stops everything.
Hmm. And so now that you've heard some of what the province plans to do or is looking at, what is the next step here for First Nations leaders?
Well, I think that now we have to bring our leadership together. So we heard from the premier last Thursday in regards to, um, putting a pause to DRIPA. And until the Gatla court case goes through the system, which would take approximately 3 years. And but nobody knows exactly, time frames. It's a Supreme Court of Canada. You can give approximations, I'm sure. And the cost, is just growing and growing. I'm sure it must be around 100 million by now, for sure. And overall, probably end up costing Canadians and British Columbians and the First Nations, probably $250 million. And that's too bad because, we got a lot of respect for the law and lawyers, but in the end, a lot of that money goes to lawyers and the legal teams on both sides. And that money, $250 million, just for that one particular court case, could have been used in a lot better ways. Like, we just had an announcement on fisheries yesterday and of over 400 million plus, in terms of wild salmon. And, what we could have done with that monies, we could have put to good use. And so, I think the chiefs are looking to respond. And a lot of times when it came to, right from the start, when they did bills 14 and 15, and then came out, a lot of these things were fast tracked, through their and made into legislation around major projects and infrastructure. And that's what we noticed about this one in particular, too. We didn't have the meaningful consultation. We basically had 5 business days to respond to the amendments. And then on top of that, in terms of co-development and working together, because that's what we had technical tables, senior official tables, and leadership tables where we sat down together and had an orderly process. We're noticing the premier making unilateral decisions and getting in front of microphones and responding. And some people were saying, you guys are caught in a corner. We're not caught in a corner. The premier is caught in a corner because potentially, this could see a lot of uncertainty on the land, potential not potential, there will be court cases because the honor of the crown is at stake here in terms of, good faith negotiations that need to be upheld and not taken down. And, it was a law, and we were co-developing all of those things. And now we're in a situation where the leadership are very frustrated, even angry, and they're saying that, they told us that pretty clear, but we still need to, again, internally get together with our leadership, and we have to respond probably with a press release and letter to, the chiefs outlining, giving them the details, a briefing note, and things of that nature, what we're potentially going to do here, because it appears that the premier is going to go ahead and try to put a pause to this. And we've been trying to avoid, direct action and protest, but as the frustration mounts here in British Columbia, that's what you potentially could see.
Robert Phillips, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I thank you as well.
Robert Phillips is the political executive of the First Nations Summit in BC. APTN also reached out to BC Premier David Eby's office for an interview, but he wasn't made available. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player, or email your suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets. Hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.